Okay, hello, and welcome to the video lecture. This lecture corresponds to the first meeting of Unit 2 in the Politics of Food course. This is the introduction to Unit 2 on production. I'll go ahead and share the slides for today. Okay, Unit 2 production. We've just wrapped up our first unit of the course on consumption, and we're moving to our second unit on production. So the plan for our meeting today, the plan for this video lecture, I'm going to start with a brief history of global food markets. This is sort of an anomaly in this course here. We're going to get historical, very historical, going back hundreds of thousands of years to talk about, to reflect on how people have produced and traded food throughout human history and how it has related to politics. They'll have a brief introduction to the topics that pertain to this unit. And I will introduce also the assignment, the main writing assignment that's due at the end of Unit 2, the policy brief. Okay, so I'd like you to start by reflecting on this opening question. Should the U.S. produce most of the food that is consumed domestically? Why or why not? Right here, we're looking at an image of the port of Los Angeles. Um, there are big debates about between locavores and global food commodity chains. How much should we value? How much should we prioritize having a local food system versus being embedded in a global food system? This is a question that's going to be in the background of everything that we're talking about over the next few sessions. Okay, so I'm just going to jump right into this four-part lecture, which I refer to as a brief history of global food markets. Like I said, we're going to go back about 200,000 years to the first hunter and gatherer civilizations, or about 200,000 years ago is when we can date the appearance of the first anatomically modern human, right? And the first humans, so this should take about 15 or 20 minutes, this lecture. It's going to take place over the course of four slides. In part one, we're focusing on subsistence. And here we're looking at the first humans that existed about 200,000 years ago, um, up until about 5,000 or 3,000 years before Common Era, right? So we're talking about up until just about 5,000 years ago, from today. So for the vast majority of human history, right? About 95% of human history, if my math is right. We were hunters and gatherers. We were not agricultural producers. It's strange to think about because all we know, and all any sort of known history knows, is people um, farming communities, and most of our food coming from agricultural food. But for the vast majority of human history, we were nomadic. We went from place to place, collecting plants, seeds, and hunting animals. The very first states, the very first sort of what we can think of as more complex forms of political organization, appear somewhere between 5,000 and 3,000 years before the Common Era, right? So about 5,000 to 7,000 years before today. This occurs in the Middle East in what's known as the Fertile Crescent, when civilizations begin to start um, domesticating wheat and building farms around these domesticated wheat, so sort of smaller farms. Um, and the very first states emerged around grain agriculture, right? So the need for rulers of these societies to tax, store, and control the production of grains, like I said, initially wheat, later corn and rice and other basic grains. During this period, food was mostly consumed where it was produced. I'd encourage you to click on the link in this slide. It will take you to a video on YouTube, which is a lecture delivered by James Scott, a famous scholar of rural politics. He's reading a section of this book, which you can see on the slide, Against the Grain. In this snippet, of the book, he talks about the process of domesticating plants and how this led to huge changes in the lifestyles of humans, right? How it made us move from being relatively autonomous, connected to nature, to being much more rigid and much more disciplined in our day-to-day lifestyle. Um, sort of how the lives of humans became tied to the seasons and the cycles of agricultural production for sort of a single monoculture, right? As opposed to being sort of connected to many different biorhythms, many different um, plants and animals that appear over the course of a year, right? It sort of connects humans to what he refers to as a single metronome, which is the cycle of wheat or or that one staple grain that those societies produce. Okay, so in these early agricultural states, political power, the process of politics, is mostly about control over land and grain, right? The rulers were those people who were able to tax, forcing producers to give a portion of their product, a portion of the grain that they produce, to the ruler, um, and controlling this grain, guarding it, right? Keeping control over these small sort of city states. Um, okay, so then we can talk about part two. We can refer to as the birth of the first agrarian states. And I break this into two different sub periods. There's sort of the ancient empires here. We can think of ancient Rome, ancient Egypt, and in a lot of ways, slightly more contemporary empires like the Mayans and the Aztecs and the Incas in Latin America um, share some similarities here. So these empires in sort of this is sort of the pre-medieval period in Western Europe and in East Asia. This is where you started to see these small sort of agrarian city-states expand into more complex empires that became more technologically advanced. And we started to see states that were larger, um, and they were taxing grain production over a much larger um, geographical area in order to support the development of cities and armies. And this is where, as a tourist, if you go to archaeological sites or these ancient societies, um, ancient Rome, ancient Egypt, ancient Greece and Europe, or sort of pre-Hispanic civilizations in Latin America, for instance, similarly, sort of ancient societies in places like Japan, China, and Korea. These were more complex civilizations that still existed largely as a result of the power of taxing grain production in sort of the outlying areas of these empires. We started to see some initial trade between some of the stronger and more advanced empires. So we see trade in grain, wine, olive oil, spices. But for the most part, for the vast majority of people, the vast majority of the calories that they eat are locally produced. Also, as a result of these sort of war and conquest between empires, we see quite a lot of slavery common in agricultural production. In the Middle Ages in Europe, and also in a similar way in Japan, so between around 500 and 1500, we see a particular variant of agrarian state, which we can refer to as feudalism. So feudalism is a system where this political authority becomes decentralized. So as opposed to it being one central state, the Greek state or the Roman state or the Aztecs taxing and controlling their entire empire, they create this sort of pyramidal system of different levels of elites, dukes and lords and sort of nobility that are sort of connected and all have to and all subservient eventually to to the king or the emperor or the czar. But these local elites are the ones who sort of in their particular regions exercise quite a bit of control over land. This is when we see sort of the concentration of land and power in many different local elites in ways that sort of drives politics and drives economics, leads to revolutions and land reforms in the subsequent period as we get towards the end of the Middle Ages and move towards the Enlightenment. Um, Still during this period, food production remains mostly local, right? Political power, whether it's exercised by these regional feudal elites or by the central empire, right? Political power is still a matter of controlling land, and in this case, also controlling agricultural labor, right? In feudalism, for instance, there are these serfs or peons, right, who are the small scale people, sort of landless peasants or folks who would depend on the local notable who controlled the land. And this wasn't quite slavery, but your ability to control and extract surplus from these local lower classes was what underpinned the power of these local elites. Okay, so we can move to a third stage, which begins around 1500, and here's where we begin to see colonialism. So we're going to refer to this third period of um, our global food system as the period of colonial commodity empires. Right? This is a period that took place, beginning roughly around 1500, right? You may recall that um, Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492. So this is when we see Spain, Portugal, England, France, Holland, different European colonial powers begin to stretch out across the globe, in large part, in very large part, in pursuit of food and agricultural commodities. Um, we see, so we can sort of think of this period as the birth of sort of the first time where we're starting to have a global food system, where there are certain people in certain parts of the world for whom a big part of their diet comes from elsewhere. Huge transformations in diets as things move from continent to continent. Crops, livestock, and diseases move between different continents, the Americas, Europe, Africa, and Asia. And new staple crops absolutely transform diets around the world, right? Today we think of potatoes as being central to Irish diets, right? Tomatoes, chiles, right? We think of chiles as being central to um, food produced in Southeast Asia or South Asia, right? India and Thai food would be sort of unrecognizable if not for chiles. Well, all of these things came from the Americas, right? Potatoes, maize or corn, cassava, chiles. These are things that um, in the starting in the 1500s European colonists brought from the New World, from the Americas, back to Europe, and then later spread throughout Asia and Africa. Um, European colonialism eventually was built as huge economic enterprises as a way to produce, profit on, and trade very valuable export commodities such as sugar, coffee, tea, cocoa, and spices. Large, massive corporations, some of the first multinational corporations of importance, were created as sort of counterparts or sort of public-private partnerships between these colonial powers and um, and the private actors and financial actors that profited quite a bit from this trade. So you've probably heard of the Dutch East India Company, the British East India Company. We can think of these as the first really huge multinational corporations backed by these colonial powers, which based their entire business model on moving these agricultural commodities from place to place. European colonialism was brutal. Um, There were huge expanses in plantation agriculture, particularly for products that lent themselves to this form of production, sugar, tobacco, um, jute for making rope, right? And the colonies, the places where that were colonized by these European colonial powers, increasingly came to specialize in monoculture of export crops, right? They weren't producing food. Um, uh, they were less and less producing basic, ordinary staple food for domestic consumption, and more displacing this food that they would eat in order to grow, sugar or tea or cocoa or spices or the sorts of things that were profitable for these colonial powers. Okay, this is a period where political power um, is now no longer just about local control of land and labor. Now it has to do with this. Political power expands globally, It has to do with control over colonies, labor, and these what we can first start to refer to as global supply chains through which this commodity trade takes place. Okay, so finally we'll move to the fourth period, which we can sort of roughly date to beginning around 1900, um, industrial agriculture and the Green Revolution. So the um, the signs of industrialized agriculture appear in different places in quite different times, right? In Western Europe and in the United States, you start to see tractors and machinery appear really right around the beginning of the 20th century. It takes a lot longer in many parts of the global South, and there's still some countries and many regions today that haven't moved to industrialized agriculture. We're going to give this as a period when tractors and machinery first begin to replace animal and human labor. We see lots of advances in chemicals, chemical inputs such as synthetic fertilizers, pesticides. Hybrid seeds are developed as a way to raise productivity. This all begins to happen. There's a lot of enthusiasm around all of these innovations right around the beginning of the 20th century. In fact, if you go to the Huntington Gardens, um, near Pasadena and Los Angeles. One really interesting thing you'll see there is they have an exhibit in the gardens of the first avocado plant, right? It was a really famous, I think back in, I'm not sure, the 1920s or so. There were agronomists connected to the Huntington Library, connecting to the Huntington Gardens, who made it their job to create hybrids, right? We didn't have genetic modification yet, but you could create hybrids by crossing different plants to produce a plant that had the characteristics that you thought were most desirable. And you can see examples of these first sort of attempts at creating the most optimal avocado tree there in the Huntington Library. This really important sort of symbol, this place that represents Los Angeles about 100 years ago when it was starting to turn into an important modern city. After World War II, and here's what we're talking about more, we're watching a film about the Green Revolution. We can start to talk about this period of the Green Revolution in global agribusiness. This is where these innovations around industrialized agriculture, they just become amped up in huge ways, right? We start to see um, hybrid seeds, sort of hybridization be advancing to the point where you can have really high yield. And this takes place really principally around a couple of staple crops. Wheat and rice were the first grains to be developed according to the precepts of the Green Revolution, and later corn and other grains as well. Large scale. So now we're starting to talk about farms like what you see in the slide, right? Really large plots of land that rely much more on capital, right? Using machinery and money in order to build irrigation systems, buy advanced chemicals, buy large tractors, other sorts of machinery. Right. The Green Revolution was an attempt to sort of amp up these ideas everywhere and also to spread these ideas of a more technological form of production to the developing world, to countries in the global South that hadn't had it before. This really starts in India, Pakistan, and in Mexico is where we first start to see the Green Revolution being promoted. So food production becomes more capital, more input intensive. It's less about the labor of individual farmers and much more about machinery and chemicals and inputs. And more, we see global firms and supply chains increasingly organizing production and trade, right? So the firms that produce seeds, that produce chemicals, that produce tractors, the firms that create processed food out of these basic commodity grains. These are the companies that are starting to wield more and more political power. Okay, so now we're in a period where political power that we talked about was first mostly about land, sort of about land and labor. Under colonial period, it was a lot about sort of this political colonial power controlling trade routes. Now we're moving to a period where the actors who have the most political power are these large firms that control the technology, the inputs. They have the capital, sort of the money to spend, right? And in many ways, these companies ally during the period of the Green Revolution. They ally with governments, such as the U.S. government, in promoting the adoption of these new forms of production. Okay, so that sort of brings us to the present, right? This brings to a close um, this four-part, very rapid primer on transformations in global food systems. So let's talk about what we're going to be doing over the course of the next few course sessions. So here we are in Unit 2. This unit has to do with production and trade. Today we're talking about the Green Revolution. We've talked about the advent of global food markets. The next two topics in this unit are one of thinking about globalization by looking at Mexican tomatoes, and then thinking about the environment and climate change through the example of beef. Um, I list here some questions that we're going to be addressing in each of these other two topics we're going to be looking at in Unit 2. Okay, so when we think about the Green Revolution, I'm asking all of you to watch this film and reflect on this film about Norman Borlaug, the man who won the Nobel Prize. Um, the film is titled "The Man Who Tried to Feed the World," right? So the Green Revolution was this scientific transformation, the scientific movement that took place beginning really right after World War II and lasting. We can think of the Green Revolution in its peak as lasting from about the 1950s to the 1970s. And this was a period where US government scientists and other scientists were working really hard to develop high yield varieties of wheat and rice, right? So seeds that if you planted, you would just get more food, more calories out of that same chunk of land. And inputs to go with it, right? So the fertilizer you'd put in the soil, irrigation systems to optimize water delivery, pesticides, right? All of the sort of things you would need to help these varieties grow under optimal conditions. As a result of implementing these high yield production techniques, we saw huge productivity increases, especially in the places where the Green Revolution was most strongly promoted, like Mexico, India, and Pakistan. In Mexico, the Green Revolution, if you're familiar with Mexican geography, the Green Revolution was mostly early on, mostly really pushed in the northern states of Sinaloa and Sonora. These are states that are quite hot and dry. They're deserts, but along with the precepts of the Green Revolution, encouraged the Mexican government to invest quite a lot in installing irrigation systems and subsidies for large-scale farmers to start of wheat and corn to start adopting these modes of production. In the majority of the Mexican territory in central and southern Mexico, most people persisted, and many persist to this day in modes of production that are much more the sort of pre-Green Revolution, right? Much smaller scale, less productive. So the Green Revolution, by a lot of measures, was successful. Um, this is why Norman Borlaug received the Nobel Peace Prize. This increasing productivity is credited with preventing widespread famine. This is a period between the 1960s and the 1990s when the global population roughly doubles, but also because of these techniques, they managed to make it so that global cereal yields, the amount of cereals we think of are these basic grains like wheat, corn, and rice, also roughly double during this time period. Right. So people were after World War II, when people saw this kind of demographic boom coming, there was quite a bit of concern that there would be widespread famine. And the Green Revolution is credited with preventing that. Um, okay, but as we read, so I'm asking you to read a chapter in the Parlberg book about the Green Revolution. And there's quite a lot of debate about the Green Revolution, and these ideas have their critics today, right? And this is because we can sort of weigh the costs and benefits on both sides, right? This table here sort of lays out in a really simple way the main benefits and costs of the Green Revolution. The benefits, like I already mentioned, we had higher crop yields, reduced hunger and famine, increased supply of food, particularly these basic grains, led to lower food prices. And as we read with in the pollen reading, right, a lot of these basic grains go into making more processed food, cheap, accessible processed food that comes out of things like corn. Um, and so just this like much more greater availability of calories of food supports rapid population growth without famine. On the other hand, Parlberg and the film about Borlaug, detail quite a few costs to the Green Revolution, to this transformation in environmental production. this transformation in agricultural production. Many farmers become dependent on fertilizers, pesticides, and irrigation systems. There's quite a lot of environmental degradation in terms of um, the the chemicals that go into the groundwater, deforestation that takes place to open up space for this farming. We see unequal benefits for small versus large farmers, right? It turns out to be that large scale farmers, those with more land and more capital at their disposal, find it easier to transition to these new, more advanced techniques. Right, and there's greater corporate influence over agriculture. If you're a small scale farmer that wants to go at your own, you find it harder and harder to compete in a world where you need to, um, where really to be competitive, to have the higher crop yields, to be producing the more modern versions of these grains, you need to be collaborating with these multinational corporations, buying these seeds, buying these fertilizers, buying these pesticides. Okay, so there's a couple questions on the bottom of this slide that are worth evaluating to understand the Green Revolution. And you can sort of find answers to these questions in the Parlberg reading. So I'd encourage you to reflect on these. How did the effects of the Green Revolution vary between Asia and Latin America? Parlberg identifies two different variants of the Green Revolution that played out differently in India versus Mexico, for instance. And within countries, sort of like within Mexico or within India, who were the winners and who were the losers? Who are the farmers? Who are the business people? Who are the different actors who benefit economically from the Green Revolution? The food consumers, right? Who are the folks that we could say are better off as a result of this, and who are those we can say are worse off? Comparing large scale farmers, small scale farmers, food consumers, other sorts of auxiliary businesses that have to do with agriculture. Okay, I'm going to spend the last few minutes here just really briefly teeing up your final assignment for this unit, right? So there's two large writing assignments in this course. One of them is what I'm going to talk about right now, which is the policy brief, and the other one is the ethnographic case study, which is due at the end of the course. The policy brief pertains specifically to food production. So here what I'm asking you to do is to write a roughly 2,000 word policy brief promoting production of some new food or some new agricultural method. An example would be, a simple argument is Californian almond farmers should convert to olives, right? Um, I'm asking you to build your argument using concepts and ideas from course readings. You don't have to cite extensively the course readings, but it should somehow relate to issues we're talking about, the environment, um, agricultural productivity, uh, economic development, and so on. Importantly, this is a key part of this assignment, is working with data. So I'm asking you to include at least two figures. These could be tables or graphs with numbers that you make yourself. So you're not just taking a screenshot or copying some table or graph out of something that you see in a report or on a website. You are finding data online yourself and making this table or graph. And these reports should cite at least 4 external sources. So in a policy brief, the idea is to be very clear, very direct, very scientific. You're really trying to make a case using evidence, right? And you're pretending in this case that you are a bureaucrat. You're someone who works for the government of some, who works for a government agency of some country or in some level, right? Maybe you're working for the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Maybe you're working for the California Department of Agriculture, or maybe you're working for an agricultural ministry in some other country. In any case, you're imagining that you're writing this report to share with your superiors to promote some new policy. There are different types. If you look online and learn and read about different types of policy briefs, there's two different types. And actually, I should say there's some links to some useful sources about policy briefs in the syllabus where there's a description of this assignment. There are generally two different types of policy briefs, an advocacy brief and an objective brief. An objective brief sort of lays out all the evidence and is kind of neutral about which direction should be taken. An advocacy brief, which is what we're doing in this situation, is a type of brief that's sort of advocating for one particular action, right? So you're saying, okay, you could say, here are the alternatives, right? If we want to support um, moving to olive production in California, we could do subsidies, um, or we could tax water, right? And you could sort of describe these two different options and say, but my suggestion really is that we should be taxing water because what that's gonna do is it's gonna push people away from producing almonds, which are so water intensive. Policy briefs are very, very well organized, very clear, very concise, not flowery. Short paragraphs, short sentences, carefully organized, oriented around a single main point, right? You're presenting a problem or an opportunity and the possible solutions and what your proposed solution is. And you're really drawing and relying carefully on the table or the graph or these sort of data that you're using to back up your main point. Um, Two more slides. So the components of a policy brief, and all of your policy briefs will take the same basic structure. You have a title, you have a summary, which is usually 3 to 5 bullet points, which lay out the main things that you're saying. An introduction, which lays out the essential background and why this issue is important. The body, 2 to 4 paragraphs, maybe more than that, with the tables and graphs. Remember, altogether, this is going to be about 2,000 words. You lay out some policy options, probably two, maybe three different policy options, right? And these different policy options, you can think about them in different ways, right? So in this example of California almonds, we can say, look, there's this problem that California has a water shortage. And many, many people are growing almonds, which just consume so much water. It takes a gallon of water to produce a single almond, right? This goes in the introduction. Um, and then the body, you sort of develop the issue more, right? You're developing the issue of the problem of almonds and their water consumption. And you're also starting to develop, okay, there are other um, alternative things, right? There's olives, there's grapes, there's, I don't know, avocados, right? Other things that could potentially be grown in these same parts of California where we today grow almonds. And then you lay out different policy options. In this case, you could say these different policy options could be, okay, let's compare these options of olives versus grapes versus avocados. Or your policy options could be, look, we already have determined that olives are the way to go. The policy options are the different sorts of policies that the California government could enact that would support greater olive production, right? So maybe it's like I said, subsidizing olive farmers. Maybe it's investing in research and development to produce different sorts of olive plants that are going to be conducive to California conditions. Maybe it's investing in infrastructure, right? Big factories that the California government's going to help produce. They're going to make it so that these olive producers can turn their olives into olive oil, what have you, right? Laying out different policy options that are going to work in favor of your preferred agricultural outcome. In this case, getting California farmers to switch from almonds to olives. And finally, you end with a couple paragraphs of your recommendation. Here's the one policy I think we should pursue and why. Um, all right, so here on this final slide, I just lay out an example of an outline of what this policy brief might look like in this example of converting almonds to olives in California, right? The title, the summary with the bullet points, the introduction that has this background, the body, where you're sort of building up this argument. Almonds consume too much water. Olives consume much less water. The olive market can produce good jobs from backing up this whole idea. The policy options, like I said, subsidies, research and development, infrastructure, taxes, right? And finally, your specific recommendation and why. All right. So that's all we've got for today's lecture, and I look forward to seeing you on the next one.